splashed by all my hot takes, please subscribe or share. Go find the tweets that link to this page, Twitter profile. By the way, nobody sees your likes on Twitter, so it's okay if you like the tweets and these kinds of videos. And if you're not worried about your privacy, go ahead and retweet and send this link to a friend. There's a lot of paddle groups today, but you can find me on Twitter at Typhoon. So let's start front to back with what was most recent, and then we'll go kind of what happened a little bit over the weekend and last week. A ton to talk about today. Guys, it will be a great time today, and I'm looking forward to all the things we've got in store, including a little bit on the NBA, as well as a little bit on UFL draft and the Memphis showboats, and also, in addition to that, a little bit on the WNBA. Here we go. Great to have you along with us this afternoon. I'm Tyler Springs, as I mentioned. The thing I want to get into first, the thing that's happened most recently, which was Monday night, where the Memphis Grizzlies unfortunately fell in Summer League action against the Miami Heat in overtime with the Elam ending, and Ella Larson with the ultimate shot that drops the Memphis Grizzlies and Scotty Pippen in the championship game of NBA Summer League action. But I don't think the end result for that game is necessarily death sentence for sure on the Grizzlies. I don't even think it's a commendation for the Heat so much necessarily, although they did, fight back in that game. The Grizzlies had the lead late and ultimately coughed it up. Were able to force overtime, but ultimately could not get the job done against the Heat team that were missing a lot of their good players for balance of that game because of foul trouble. And shout out to Miami and their group for battling through in order to get the win in Summer League and stay unbeaten. That was the only Grizzlies loss in the Vegas version of NBA Summer League. But ultimately, I think I was impressed, and I think a lot of people were with the job that the Grizzlies did, and I certainly think there was carryover from the Salt Lake series. Saw a little bit of Zach Edey, Cam Spencer, some of the other guys in that you didn't see necessarily in Las Vegas. But I was impressed what the Grizzlies were able to do. They had some veteran players out there, so it is expected that they should be in a position like that. But the guys who had seen a lot of NBA action, I think, came up pretty big in that final, just maybe didn't get enough help from the guys around them. But when you go down the list and you look at the ultimate takeaways from NBA Summer League, I want to point out a couple, because I know Summer League, there are times when you feel like that doesn't matter, or, you're not playing against the best competition. How does this carry over to NBA? When I look at the Grizzlies and what they did in the Summer League, a couple of things stand out to me. One is, obviously, I want to see more time from the guys who are injured, right? We can get to Zach Edey and the other guys injured in a little bit. First thing is, you have got to give a roster spot to Scotty Pippen Jr., and it's got to happen before the end of the year. I don't think there's any question that he showed he is an NBA-capable point guard and a guy that you want on your bench. Even if that's your 15th man, you still want him up there. And I recognize, people think of Scottie Pippen as still growing, yes, but I think on a night-to-night basis, you don't know exactly what you're going to get, either health-wise or performance-wise, from Derrick Rose. Scottie Pippen Jr. has the pop on a night-to-night basis to be a really, really good sub for Ja Morant, and I think that helps the Grizzlies in a huge way in order to rest their star and make sure that he's in the right place come late season action. The Grizzlies are expecting to be competitive. Now, there are some conditions that go along with that. One of them is the health of Zach Edey and some play in the post that can stabilize the rest of the roster and the rotations. But when you look at Scottie Pippen Jr., the numbers, I think, over the last couple of games in Summer League were incredible. The triple-double on Sunday in the semifinals was huge. But he brought, at least to me, a veteran's eye to the game, especially in that championship game against Miami, to the point where I think if you were watching that game and you're a Miami fan, you're probably pretty annoyed with Pippen. And I think that's a good thing for Grizzlies fans, because he does a lot of crafty things that you would expect of a veteran, not necessarily a guy of his age, where he knows how to, A, orchestrate things and keep the offense organized, but B, he knows how to draw fouls and to get other guys a little bit off their game. If you notice, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it dirty, but I would say there were things and moments where Pippen, I think, sold a couple of things. There's a little push-pull, a little tug of the jersey here or there, and he let other guys, opponents of his, make mistakes that they had a high percentage chance of making when he found himself in those situations. He kind of, in that way, took what the defense gave him or took what the defense would allow in terms of the positions they would get themselves into. And he drew a lot of fouls, contact, and attention that way that I think opened things up not only for him, but for his teammates. And I was hugely impressed not only with his distribution, but also just the way that he navigated the game. And you saw right before halftime, the Grizzlies give up a 10-4 run when they're up by 6 in a minute and 50 seconds with him out of the game, right? He goes out with like 2 minutes to go. They give up that 10-4 run. He immediately comes back in with 10 seconds left, and a credit to Jason March for putting him in and trying to draw something up for the final 10 seconds. He draws an untimed foul and gets the Grizzlies back a 3-point lead by halftime in just 10 seconds of action. That's how critical he was on the floor in that game, and ultimately it proved huge because they sent the game to overtime, right? So I love Scotty Pippen Jr. I think he is going to be on the Grizzlies roster at some point this season. Whether or not that is before the season or not, that his two-way contract gets converted, I'm not sure. But I love the contributions he brought, and I think he is ready to be, at minimum, the Grizzlies' third point guard. I think, personally, that ought to happen by the beginning of the season. I think it's going to happen inevitably before the season is finished. I think that says good things about the Grizzlies' future depth in the backcourt. Derrick Rose is on the other side of his prime. I'm not saying he can't give you anything, but I think if you need somebody to play extended minutes at the point guard spot and you don't want to shift Marcus Smart over there, Scotty Pippen Jr., that's your guy for the Grizzlies for 2024-2025 in the quote-unquote deep backup point guard role, but I think a guy who can also play longer minutes if needed. That's what we've seen from Summer League. The other thing that stood out to me, other than, again, the lack of Zach Edey, is I think the growth that we've seen from Jake LaRavia. We've been waiting on it and didn't really get it in his rookie year, and honestly didn't get a lot of it in his sophomore year, but really has, to my eye, I think, a lot of slow-mo in his game. I think I see a lot of Kyle Anderson to him in the sense that he's got sort of this underwater type of motion where you don't feel like he's going fast enough to get things done, but he's got the length and strength to do it. Battled through, a couple of knocks during that Summer League Finals game, ended up with a huge contribution. He's a little ornery, I think, as well, a lot like Kyle Anderson. He's not going to take a lot of guff from people. So I like that about LaRavia. I think maybe that gives him some versatility, playing kind of on the wing, but also maybe more in the post, as an option down low, kind of as a small ball big, not necessarily, playing long minutes out there in like death lineup, that kind of thing. Aaron Jackson, more the guy for that, but I liked his range. I liked his focus. I thought he was doing the right things, and you saw the production there in a game with high stakes to it. So I felt like Jake LaRavia is certainly growing. Room was made for him and for Gigi Jackson and Vince Williams with the departure of Zaire Williams. So I'm looking forward to the way LaRavia is used this year. He can be, a Kyle Anderson type of guy, and I think Kyle Anderson also gives you something defensively that maybe LaRavia isn't right now, although I liked his hustle. I'm interested to see what kind of a piece Jake LaRavia can be for the Grizzlies going forward. The biggest takeaway to me, and this wasn't necessarily evident in Las Vegas, it's the fact that the Grizzlies in the second round got two guys that are going to be useful. It's not just that Jalen Wells had a really big semifinal game, obviously was on a heater, 6 of 7 from deep, showed he can shoot the three ball, showed that at his best he can play long minutes and contribute from the wing in the way that the Grizzlies desperately need. It was also that 2 picks before Bronny James went, and people felt like, well, that's just, taking a human victory cigar in the second round late there. You had the Grizzlies take a flyer on Cam Spencer, and I think it was more than a flyer for them, to be honest with you. I feel as though, even though Spencer rolled his ankle early in Las Vegas Summer League, didn't play after that Monday game against the Mavericks, I thought he was superb in terms of the efficiency you saw from him. He brought the right mentality. People have talked about how a little bit off-kilter he is, just the craziness, that he's willing to undergo to win basketball games. I think, to me, when Cam Spencer is playing at his best, I'm not saying it's going to be this way now. I'm not saying it's going to be this way even 6 months from now. But he looks like, I would say, a decaf version of a Derek White or a Fred VanVleet or a Malcolm Brogdon, one of those guys who's like fringe all-star level and maybe necessarily doesn't get the credit in any particular year, but is always playing at a high level, makes the right plays, knows how to set people up. And honestly, because of the playmaking that I saw from him, and a little bit because of his size or lack thereof, I think my biggest takeaway and projection for the year to come, going out there a little bit on a limb, I think Cam Spencer is the 15th player on the roster, is your third point guard on the roster for 2025. I'm not saying this year he's going to make an impact. I don't know that he's going to be on the opening day roster. I'm not sure that he's going to be on a playoff roster for the Grizzlies. But I think by the time we come to November and October 2025, we're seeing a Grizzlies point guard depth chart that looks like Ja Morant, Scotty Pippen Jr., and then Cam Spencer behind him. Because Spencer, with his size or, a lack thereof, I think you shift him over to the point guard spot and he becomes instantly a much better matchup for some smaller guards. He can also orchestrate the offense, as we've seen. Get a little bit of that at Connecticut, but his stats compare extremely well with Luke Kennard, and I think he offers more playmaking, more on the defensive end, and obviously a cheaper price over the next couple of seasons than Kennard. So it wouldn't shock me if the Grizzlies had a backloaded deal with Kennard if they give him the extension this summer, and perhaps we see him disappear by the time 2025 season rolls around next year. But I would say at least they should keep him for now. He provides the shooting on the outside. Maybe you could pair him with guys like Vince Williams, G.G. Jackson, even Cam Spencer on the perimeter to provide you multiple options, which is obviously all to say that can make some sense. If you put Ja Morant in there, you add Desmond Bane on the wing, you get Jaren Jackson or even Zach Edey doing a little work screen and roll. Maybe Jaren's, the third shooter, quote-unquote, out on the perimeter. Maybe you clear out 4 shooters on the perimeter and you just let Ja drive, right? It depends on the situation. But I think Cam Spencer is much more a part of the Grizzlies' future than his summer league minutes maybe would show, especially since they, were kind of precautionarily holding him out over the last couple of weeks. I think Cam Spencer is going to be an NBA player for quite some time, and I think it's going to start with the Grizzlies making him their third point guard come next season. Scotty Pippen Jr. ahead of him on the depth chart. That's my kind of big hot takeaway from the Grizzlies' time at Summer League. I thought it was awesome to see those guys interacting in that way, and I felt like it was Spencer, certainly, and Zach Edey, who we wanted to see more of, but even not seeing more of them, I felt like they were guys that should be future picks that make sense for the Grizzlies to play a lot of, right? They should be future rotation pieces, maybe not this year, but in years to come. Scotty Pippen Jr., I think, first in line for that. We'll see how the wings shake out with G.G. Jackson and Vince Williams and whoever else is over there with Kennard and Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart. Obviously, it's a gaggle of guards back there, and you've got to figure out, if you're Taylor Jenkins, just what to do offensively with all those pieces. I think someday you're going to see a depth chart at point guard for the Grizzlies that includes Ja Morant, Scotty Pippen Jr., and Cam Spencer, and I think that's going to be a point guard trio that does a lot of damage in NBA level. Let me shift gears now for a minute and get to the thing that happened over the weekend that everybody was crowing about, the WNBA All-Star Game. I thought it was really, really cool to see WNBA All-Star Game as something that, in a lot of ways, felt like it should have been probably more surprising to people, or maybe less surprising, you would say. But I felt as though there was not a lot of opportunities for people to look at Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark prior to this game, obviously, in the same room, right, on the same level. Felt like in this particular game, they were huge. I thought they were incredibly impactful, I think, for the WNBA All-Stars to win this game, but I also felt like in this game they were, I would say they were some of the best players on the floor, Clark in particular, with a lot of the great finds, and I felt like this was predictable. Like you could imagine this thawing out because you felt like there was, in a lot of ways, going to be a chance for Clark and Reese to play together, right? So why did we build up this narrative that they hate each other, they can't stand each other, they'll never want to be in the same room with each other? they are the future for this Olympic team that we're going to watch here in a couple of weeks, right? So it's great to see Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese both succeeding. I'm glad they kind of had their thaw out, if you will, rather than those two being frozen out in some way. And they had a huge game where the Team WNBA upset Team USA with a just gigantic night from Arike Ogunbowale. That was so fun to me, and to be honest with you, I kind of fell in love with Dallas when I started the season watching the WNBA on the League Pass because of Arike Ogunbowale, who I remembered from college and the big shots she made at Notre Dame. And I always tell myself as a broadcaster, it's a really bad thing to fall in love with a volume scorer, but gosh, she is just so fun. And when she gets on a heater like she did on Saturday night in Phoenix, it was, something to behold. Congrats to her for having a huge game. I am hopeful that Olympics, obviously, he will be a part of the puzzle, and I think by that time, hopefully, some older veterans will have cleared out, and she'll be able to represent her country on the biggest stage internationally. I love that result for Team WNBA. I loved how hard they played. Obviously, they can do it a little differently this year with break coming afterward, and a lot of them feeling like they had something to prove. But I just love the results from Clark, from Ogunbowale, and from the game overall. Elsewhere on WNBA weekend, I felt like there were a lot of things where there were adjustments that could be made, right? What do I mean? What I mean is, obviously, working on some graphic stuff. What I mean is, I think that there are plenty of opportunities to get more WNBA players a little bit more shine. And I think that has to start with some forward thinking for the WNBA, right? I think the NBA has done the Rising Stars Challenge, the rookie sophomore game, for the last few years. Recognize they've had to change the format a little bit to drum up some interest in that. But I really like the idea of the WNBA going ahead and saying, wow, we had such a huge showing at this 2024 All-Star game. Let's expand for 2025 and let's create basically an undercard, a WNBA version of a Rising Stars game, right? You could, I think, shape it in a similar way to the NBA's game with a little bit of an adjustment. And here's where I would like to see the adjustment made. Like the NBA, I think you could play 4 teams of 7 in a sort of a semifinal and a final bracket. Play those games to 30, right? You have the Elam ending. You play those games to 30 in the first round, the semifinal round, and then the final round is played to 21, right? But it's 4 teams of 7 made up from a pool, and the pool is top 8 rookies, top 8 sophomores, and because the WNBA, I think, is different from the NBA, not only smaller, but has more veterans that people don't know, but should pick the top 12-ish veterans from the WNBA in that particular season that don't have a previous All-Star game appearance. Obviously, if you have an All-Star game appearance, I think maybe consider playing in kind of an undercard game or a Rising Stars game to be beneath you or kind of behind you. But if you've never been in an All-Star game, get Julie Van Loo in there, a rookie at like 31 years old, right? That would be cool, and I think people would appreciate how good she is. You get some honorary coaches to coach those teams, and maybe you get some assistance from the WNBA to lead those teams in terms of an X's and O's standpoint. Although I think Cheryl Miller did a fine job coaching real All-Star team the other day. He obviously prepared and knows a lot of basketball. Stepped in nicely, not necessarily having a ton of in-season from those players and what they had been running. She just told them kind of go out there and play and shape things to her eye. Maybe you give honorary coaches, famous alumni like a Sue Bird, Mika Catchings, those folks, a chance to run those teams in the quote-unquote the Rising Stars Challenge. I think you can draw a lot of interest that way, not only because bring more eyeballs to veteran players, but also because you've never had a rookie class like this one and the one to come next year, right? You think about next year. Yeah, okay, let's say Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese both progress and they're in the All-Star game again, right? You can have, in theory, Tia Jackson, Cameron Brink, healthy, Aaliyah Edwards, Mila Cardoso, J.C. Sheldon, Leonie Phoebish, Kate Martin, right? Everybody's darling. Alyssa Peely, if she's having a better sophomore year than a freshman year. You could have all of those name players in the Rising Stars Challenge, quote unquote. If you want to call it, I don't know, the Generation W game, right? Because people know those players from their college careers and from their profiles at the WNBA draft. They will still be available to you to select, kind of raise the level of this game. So you join that with rookies who, let's say it's not Juju Watkins and it's not Paige Beckers who go next year to this Rising Stars game or the Generation W game. Maybe they're in the All-Star game, okay? You still have probably Kiki Iriafen, Anissa Morrow, Haley Van Lith, lots of other names out there where they will draw attention to the women's game this year at the college level. They will be big profiles in March, and I think they'll be drafted as well and have a chance to make a lot of these rosters. So it would be cool to see those names as well on the rookie level to kind of take on the already established, quote-unquote, WNBA second-year players in the likes of, Martins, your Brinks, your Edwards, your Cardosos, those types. So I think seeing a Generation W game as kind of an underguard, as a precursor to next year's 2025 WNBA All-Star game would be the thing that I would like most in terms of an adjustment and giving us a little bit more, right? If you looked at this year's game and you said, well, who would have been among the the dozen or so veterans that could have been in this game, I think you would have put Marina Mabrey on there. I don't think she's made an All-Star game, and she certainly made a name for herself. Hilarious, by the way. You've got to appreciate the fact that she gets into the three-point contest. She immediately throws shade at Jonquel Jones, and then she finishes last among that whole three-point contest crew. That is just some incredible WWE level heel behavior for Marina Mabrey, and I think that is the kind of sort of fun-loving thing. Even if she she means that she really believes those things, I think fans are attracted to that kind of confidence and and just a little bit of that kind of drama. I think people in the NBA, if they saw a similar thing between a couple of players in the three-point contest, I think they'd find that highly funny. But in terms of the vets who are deserving, who would have made it this year, if you would have looked at who should be in a kind of a Generation W game, Kennedy Carter's had a great year. He should have been there. You could probably point to Dejanay Carrington for the contending Sun, one of the best teams in the league, probably maybe the best team in the league if that Mabrey trade that they orchestrated right before the All-Star break comes to fruition the way they want it to. Man, they really need some offense and she can bring both of those things when she is on. I think that was a huge trade for the Connecticut Sun, and I'm so curious to see how it works out for them taking on the New York Liberty and the rest of the East after the All-Star break. We're going to have to wait a little while to see it, but maybe Mabrey fits in more seamlessly because she's got a little bit of time to adjust to that situation with a month off. But you would have seen probably Melissa Harris, or rather I should say Melissa Smith from the Indiana Fever, Ty Harris, who's having a huge year for Connecticut, Tierra McCowan probably, who's working well in tandem with Arike Ogunbowale in Dallas. You could see some other veterans. I mentioned Julie Van Loo, who's a unique rookie in that she's a lot older than most of these rookies, but had played a long time in Europe, well known over there, and Mystics get her, and I think they got a great player. But I think for people to be properly introduced to those players, I think is certainly one of those candidates that people could choose to see in a Generation W game. That's what I'd like to see from the WNBA in 5 Generation W game. The way that it's played gives a little more light to the WNBA, because people can write all these articles they want about Allisha Gray pulling the double, right? Congratulations to her. It's another $110,000 in the bank for being the first player ever to win the skills challenge and the three-point contest. She's awesome. And obviously people who followed 3-on-3 basketball know her story a little bit from her participation in that circuit. But I just think this is the WNBA's moment to capitalize on huge classes of players that actually are known to their audience and to kind of expand on who their audience has a chance. That's kind of my take on WNBA. Lastly, but not least, I want to try and get to what the Memphis Showboats tried to do in the UFL draft. That was obviously something that came along last week, week before NFL training camps. So, the roster situations are a little bit wonky there. But me, as a guy who covers the UFL this season and covered the Showboats as well, I felt like interesting choices made there, and I want to go over a few of those if I can. I'm gonna see if I can get this. If I can get this graphic right. Oh boy, is this video all gone on without sound? I hope not, but there's certainly a chance that that's happened. Well, I guess we'll find out. But in any case, I guess I can't get the UFL draft up there, but it's been interesting to see John DeFilippo and company go to work. They certainly decided that there were certain principles that they wanted to go after. Basically, I think restocking some things on offense was key for them, and obviously their offense was disappointing this year. But for them to make the choices they made sets them apart a little bit. I'm going to tell you how. Obviously, getting the first pick in the draft with that late season win over Houston is huge, right? So they ended up having the first selection at quarterback, running back, and wide receiver in the draft. And they went with Kansas's Jason Bean. They went with Memphis's Blake Watson, which is a huge hometown pick, but also I think would add great athletic ability to their backfield along with Bean. And they went with wide receiver Jalen Coker out of Holy Cross. So they picked a small school guy from the wide receivers. But those are three of their first four picks. And you are going to have to judge those positions fairly harshly because the Showboats had basically their selection of anybody on the board at that point at that position. And those are the three guys they took. Now, some of this is trying to balance who do you think is talented and also who do you think is going to be available, right? Right now, we're trying to assume that all of these guys who are all contracted by NFL teams currently are going to be available to the Showboats in the spring, right? You make the pick with the hope that they will be available and interested in playing in the UFL in the spring. You don't know that for sure, but you're hopeful that, like, Jason Bean was not going to get a lot of time with the Indianapolis Colts. Blake Watson is going to want more reps than he gets with the Denver Broncos. Jalen Coker is going to want more playing time than he gets with the Carolina Panthers. That is the hope, right? But you are certainly betting big on those guys making a dent for your team by taking them with three of your first four picks in this first ever 2024 UFL college draft. Look, that whole first round, okay, if you were going to guess, football fans know, NFL draftniks know, what's the first round going to look like? Quarterback, offensive lineman, pass rusher, right? It was the whole round was basically quarterbacks, offensive lineman, and defensive lineman. And one offensive lineman went in every single round of the draft. So that tells you, I think, the kind of premium that teams place on trying to build up their trenches. However, somehow the Memphis Showboats, who had, I think, roundly considered the worst offensive line in the UFL last season, they only take one offensive lineman, Andrew Rame out of Oklahoma, who's currently with the Carolina Panthers. Out of 19 offensive linemen selected, they took one. And not only that, they waited until the sixth round to take him. That is strange to me because he was the 12th offensive lineman off the board. So either you believed there was a lot of talent offensively along the line, and you could pick from any number of guys because you got the 12th guy on the board and you're okay with that, or you felt like there were other things you had to prioritize before offensive line, just better players out there, and you went that direction, and you're going to find other places to grow and build your offensive line, maybe through free agency, not necessarily through this draft. So I'm really interested to see how that choice from Dennis Polian in concert with John DeFilippo plays out. I recognize this is a first-time thing for everybody, but you're trying to figure out who the different players are that guys are going to go and get. Different teams have different strategies. We'll see if this one in particular works out, right? Bean, I think what you have to like is highly athletic guy. Came along maybe a little bit slowly for Kansas fans' liking, but ended up giving them two great seasons near the end of his career. A guy who's built to run, but not necessarily inclined to run a whole lot. Can use his legs, certainly mobile, I think, in a way, more like Troy Williams than necessarily a Josh Love or I want to say Case Keenum, and I know that's not his name. Case Cookis, who the Showboats fans saw this year. There were 4 QBs drafted, including names like Chevin Cordero from San Jose State, John Reese Plumlee, who Ole Miss fans know went to UCF, and then the other quarterback drafted, I'm trying to think of who it was. I think it was, was it Lombardi? Rocky Lombardi? Well, Rocky Lombardi, Sam Hartman, Tanner Mordecai all went. Keaton Slovis was the other guy that I was thinking of, who was drafted, I think, in the first 3 rounds. Keaton Slovis out of Pittsburgh, previously of USC. So it was interesting to me to see those quarterbacks taken and the places where they were taken. I think, you make a great bet taking Blake Watson at running back second. The other running backs that came off early were Mizzou's Cody Schrader and TCU's Amani Bailey. I think both of them had really good years. Your third pick on the board was Evan Anderson, the defensive tackle out of Florida Atlantic. He was the 4th defensive lineman to come off the board at the time that he went. And then, as we said again, Jalen Coker, first wide receiver off the board, and that is despite 10 wide receivers total being drafted, even including a second one drafted in the 10th round by the Showboats to wrap up their draft. So that was really interesting. And I think because those picks were made in the positions they were, you get to judge those positions, quarterback, running back, and wide receiver, pretty harshly. And hopefully the Showboats figure out something else to do along the offensive line. We'll have to see, because when you look at other places where they're hopeful to get impact, maybe you point to McAllen Castles playing that similar role to Sage Surratt, who was a good receiver 2 years ago and not quite as good this past season with the Showboats. I'm interested to see certainly how their defense fares, because you didn't go necessarily early with picks for either your secondary or your defensive line, and the message all year was, hey, we've got to get pressure from our defensive front. If we don't get that, we don't have anything defensively. You only used 1 pick on a defensive back, a corner out of Maryland, Jaquan Shepard, when you had a lot of trouble last year with not only corner but also safety. You've got really like 1 solid safety right now in Jeray Elder. You've got maybe 1-2 solid corners in Kyrie Woods, and if you want to count Delrick Abrams in there, Lamont McFadder was all right at times. I thought Abrams was pretty good in spots, but you need more depth in that secondary, and they did not address that in this draft. So when I try to discern whether or not the Showboats won this draft, jury's out. Mine too. But I think the teams that win this draft, right, that you can see, I think, competing strategies across 4 teams, the Showboats being one of them. And this is how I'll wrap this up. 1, you have the Showboats model, which is the one that Dave Bowler also followed for the St. Louis Battlehawks. They also went quarterback, running back, defensive lineman in the first 3 rounds, right? And they're the ones that got Chevin Cordero and Cody Schrader. So it'll be really interesting to see if Cordero and Schrader or Bean and Watson make it to the UFL and actually see playing time next year. But I think the teams that on paper look like they were identity conscious, I'll say, were Birmingham and San Antonio. And maybe you say, well, of course they were. They already have good teams. They're the teams that made the final. Well, yeah, I know they made the UFL championship game. But good teams tend to try and stay where they are. And for Zach Potter to go heavy on offense, right, to go offensive lineman, and then running back with Amani Bailey, also adding wide receiver and tight end depth. They chose a wide receiver out of Illinois, Isaiah Williams, after Jalen Coker had been selected out of Holy Cross. So we'll see how that plays. They're trying to add to their tight end camp again behind Jay Sternberger. And you felt like they couldn't get any deeper tight end than they already were with Sternberger and Thomas, but perhaps they will. And then Mark Lillibridge with San Antonio, they built heavily on defense for their first 5 picks being defensive players, even though you could argue Wade Phillips' defense was the best in the league last year. So it'll be interesting to see, do you go heavy to one side or do you kind of spread some picks out and also make skill position picks? Birmingham and San Antonio kind of went the heavy to one side route, and Memphis and St. Louis, one of which made the playoffs, one of which didn't come close, kind of went the more skill position route for their choices in the 2024 UFL draft. Next up is free agency, and we'll be interested to see how that goes for UFL players. Again, a lot of them hopefully will sign with UFL teams if they don't get the chances they want with NFL teams or even on NFL practice squads. So we'll have to see how it all turns out for John DeFilippo, Dennis Polian, and the bunch. That's my take on the UFL draft. I'll have more content coming on the Memphis Tigers later this week and next week as well. So be sure to keep your eyes peeled for this YouTube channel for that. And do your best, get some rest. And until the next time, I'm Tyler Springs, signing off Typhoon Streams.